Hello, and welcome to Module 8 Taking Action, Diagnosing, Defining, and Communicating, and Designing Interventions for Ineffective Teaching. Before we get started, let's just take a look at where we are at. So, we spent the first 7 modules really building a foundation in regards to that purpose of teacher evaluation and supervision to support teacher growth. We spent the last 3 weeks in the framework, developing our skills and understanding of collecting evidence and then analyzing and using that evidence to provide feedback to teachers. All of evaluation is focused around continuously improving teacher practice in the classroom to result in increased student learning. This week, we're going to change and shift our focus to addressing ineffective teacher behaviors. And we're going to look at 3 different things: diagnosing, defining, and communicating and designing interventions. So, there are 3 module objectives this week. The first is we're going to review and understand different ways to diagnose ineffective practices. And then we are going to identify and develop strategies to really clearly define what the concerns are. And then we're going to learn about the components of effective intervention plans. And this is how Module 8 connects to the early modules. So, really, um, we'll go back to module 1 and 2, where we spent time looking at the purpose of intervention. And 98% of teacher evaluation is used to support teacher growth and continuous improvement of practice. About 2% of teacher evaluation is spent addressing ineffective practice, and in some cases, coaching or working ineffective teachers out of the profession after they've had a reasonable time and amount of support to improve their practice. Now, we're only going to spend 1 week on this, and I can tell you that, again, the majority of your evaluation and supervision practices when you become an evaluator will be spent on working and leveraging those components to support growth. But there will be a time when you will have to address ineffective practices. And so we are going to spend 1 week thinking um, and applying our knowledge that we build to this. But I'm going to tell you, when the time comes, one, hold on to these resources so you can go back to them. But two, when you come to a place when you are going to have to address ineffective practices, ask for help. It is there's a lot of different skills and sometimes requirements that are involved. So it's really important to work closely with somebody else who has experience, somebody in an HR department. If your district is small to where there isn't an HR department, reach out. Maybe it's me or somebody else. But the first time that you're going through that process of addressing ineffective practices, it really does help to have a mentor or somebody who's been through that process help you through it. But our purpose this week is to understand those basic components and start thinking about what skills we're going to utilize, and what approaches we're going to take to address ineffective practices. So, again, our focus this week, and I want to make connections, you're still going to use a lot of the skills that we've talked about and that you're building through this course. You're just going to use it through a different lens and for a different purpose. But in terms of gathering evidence and data and analyzing that evidence and using the language and the standards that I've identified in that framework, all 3 of those things are going to be used, and you're going to leverage those to diagnose, define and communicate, and design effective interventions. So, the background and research this week that you're going to engage in comes primarily from two resources. And again, these are complete texts and books, and I don't expect you to read these. But as you move forward in your career, these could be two resources that you might want to use to deepen or develop your skills further. But for our purposes this week, I'm going to provide you some slide decks that summarize the key points from these two pieces. So the first is Hard Conversations Unpacked. And this is by Jennifer Abrams. And this book really gets into how to structure difficult conversations. The evaluation process that we've explored, one of the obstacles or challenges is providing objective feedback to teachers about their practice. And when I was reading your reflections on feedback that you've received, several people talked about how much they valued getting feedback from an evaluator that went beyond just what they were doing well. And so we know that people, like even ourselves, we want that feedback. Yet there's this phenomenon where evaluators are not providing that accurate feedback to the people that they're working with. And so one of the things that people brought up in their reflections was the importance of trust and building relationships. So when these conversations are happening, teachers aren't defensive or aren't feeling judged. They know that the intention and the purpose is for continuous growth. And the second piece is establishing that mindset that evaluation and supervision is all about supporting individuals in improving their practices. Hard Conversations Unpacked is just one resource. There's a lot of resources on how to have difficult conversations. This is a reality of being a leader, and so this is the one that I'm using to give you a frame in constructing some of those. The second book is Strengthening Teacher Evaluations, which is the Skillful Leader 3. And it specifically focuses on taking action to improve ineffective instruction. And this is where this cycle comes from that we will be using once you've determined that indeed this isn't a school-wide issue. This is an individual classroom issue that needs to be addressed, and it is using the diagnose, define and communicate, and then design the intervention model. So those are the foundational texts that are informing this week's module. Again, you're not going to be reading them, and so I've included two slide decks in your resources today. They are not annotated by my voice, so you're going to have to read through them. But the first one gets into just diagnosing. And so these slides summarize the key concepts, which starts with one, planning for hard conversations. And that's where the first part of your application assignment is going to come from. So that slide deck of diagnosing has that first application assignment in it, as well as in the assignments. It's going to get into what data sources that you would use to identify or diagnose a ineffective practice. And it's going to take you through specific data that you can use in terms of managing classrooms, delivering instruction, and then the third one is professionalism. And then it's going to get into this 3-step process that you use to really get to the root issue. Because the first step in this improvement of ineffective practices is really diagnosing accurately that root issue or that first area of concern that's going to be addressed. So it's first being clear on your data that you're collecting, which we've already done the last 3 weeks. The second is to identify symptoms of ineffective practice. So things that you would see inside and outside the classroom, that would be red flags to you. The third then are these diagnostic questions that you ask yourself to really get to the root issue. And this is an important part of the process that is really difficult for me to simulate with you asynchronously. But a lot of times at first glance, it might appear that there's a lot of different problems. But when you're diagnosing, you're really working to get to that root issue. The second slide deck picks up on it begins to review that diagnosis phase, and it's actually going to get into then specific components that you can diagnose. So we talked about management and instruction in this first slide deck, and then the second one's going to get into like real specific practices like establishing relationships with students, or using assessment practices in the classroom. So there's some scenarios that the slides go through. So then the second part, once you diagnose, is very clearly defining and communicating the effective practice and using data, right, to support that diagnosis. And then as determining like where that concern falls on a continuum of concerns, and then designing appropriate and supportive interventions. Two subcomponents or resources that are available to support this determination of where the concern falls um, is this continuum for concerns. So as an evaluator, you're having to not only like, once I've identified this is an effective practice, then I have to like assess how big of a deal is this, right? Is this something small that we can fix? Like, it's just, this is a concern. It might be a one-time thing. If I give written feedback and go follow up with this person, can they address it? Or I always use this. There's this formative piece where we're having conversations, and I'm working with it with somebody informally. And then there's this point where now it's going to be on paper. And that's really important because not every concern has to go directly to a plan. And there are times if you jump too soon to get on paper and make that a formal communication of concern, then you can damage your relationship with the person and or individual and their ability to then respond to the feedback. But you can also, that can ripple out and have impact on other practitioners in your building as well. And so something you're going to think about is what's your criteria and what's your process for that informal feedback and addressing, and then at what point do you move to a formal plan on paper is what I call it. When do you go on paper? But it's always good to start off paper. And then the same is true for interventions. So this gradual release of what types of interventions you're going to put in place as well. And so thinking about what do you have in place, what's the least intrusive approach, and then how do you level up with teachers. So if you use MTSS in your buildings, I use that generalization a lot of times when I'm speaking with principals and I'm helping them, address staff issues. Is okay, when you're thinking about your teachers, like by tiering them, okay, these are your tier 3 teachers. So how are we going to layer up supports? And then finally, you are going to be writing an improvement plan for a scenario that I provided you with. And there is a framework to support you in writing that improvement plan. So your assignment this week has 3 parts. And again, we're working on diagnosing, defining, and communicating and designing. So part 1 is about having a hard conversation. And so you are presented with a scenario that is isolated. So it doesn't necessarily need a full-blown improvement plan, but there needs to be a conversation with the individual who posted something on social media that was was disrespecting the principal or you. So you're going to use the question framework from the Hard Conversations text to plan a conversation with that teacher or individual. Part two is going to be to actually apply what you learn to diagnose, communicate, and design an intervention. And so there is a problem description or application scenario of a teacher and the practices. And so you are going to define and diagnose, define and communicate what the problem is or ineffective practice, and then you're going to develop a plan um, to include the accountable recommendations. And you're going to use your own district framework. So use your framework standards and that language from those rubrics that you believe would be relevant. And then you can utilize that improvement plan rubric as your framework. And then finally, I want you to start thinking about this like informal versus formal. So there's all kinds of strategies and practices that you can use. I'm going to move this up so you can see it. So I want you to focus first on formal. So you need to describe from your district, like what your district prescribes as the process to support the diagnosis of the problem, definition and communication and interventions. Many districts have layered plans. So it will start with a targeted improvement plan and then maybe move to something more significant. So that's what I want you to investigate. And then, if possible, and I do think this would be really valuable if you have time to do this, discuss with an evaluator within your organization or your building. What criteria do they use to move from informal to formal? So, um, I um I do feel like I've got my head above water again. I'm in week 2 of being the high school principal and the curriculum director, and I'm really excited because over the last 2 weeks I've been able to complete 9 informal observations and 2 formal observations with teachers. So I'm really reflecting on the things that we've been talking about and I've been learning about through this class in my own practice. I hadn't evaluated a teacher formally in 5 years. So I'm having that experience as well. I should be more responsive to your questions via email. But reach out if you do have any more questions on this module. I hope you have a great week.